the woman no one saw. The morning sun reflected against the glass towers of Ashford Enterprises, scattering golden light across the city's skyline as the streets below came alive with the rhythm of ambition. Among the thousands hurrying toward another day of work, Victoria Chen walked steadily, her small frame almost swallowed by the towering skyscraper she entered every morning at precisely 7:30. The lobby smelled faintly of coffee and perfume, a blend of urgency and power. Marble floors gleamed like mirrors beneath her feet, and her reflection moved quietly, like a shadow in a world that had forgotten how to notice her. For 4 years, Victoria had worked in this building, serving as the executive assistant to one of the most influential men in the city, Dominic Ashford, the millionaire CEO of Ashford Enterprises. To most people, his name meant brilliance, success, and fear. To Victoria, it meant silence, sharp commands, and the endless hum of expectations that left no room for mistakes. She managed his calendar, coordinated meetings, wrote reports, solved problems before they reached him, and yet she existed like furniture, necessary but invisible. No one asked how she was, no one remembered her birthday, no one noticed when she stayed past midnight to meet impossible deadlines. She had learned to accept invisibility the way one accepts rain on a cold day, something inevitable, something you cannot change. Dominic Ashford was a man who carried power effortlessly. At 38, he had built his empire from nothing, transforming abandoned warehouses into luxury buildings, rescuing forgotten streets and turning them into thriving districts. He was disciplined, confident, and precise. Every decision he made seemed to turn into gold. His tailored suits spoke of perfection. His voice carried authority that made rooms fall silent. And yet, behind that confidence was a man who believed emotions were distractions. Kindness was weakness, and relationships were risks he could not afford. He lived for results, not connections. He didn't realize that in building his empire, he had built walls around himself. Walls that kept everyone out, including the one person who quietly kept his empire running smoothly. Each morning, Victoria prepared everything before he arrived, the printed reports arranged by priority, the coffee placed on his desk, the schedule updated down to the minute. When the elevator doors opened at 8:15 and Dominic walked through, his presence filled the space like gravity. Phones stopped ringing for a moment, whispers faded. He nodded to no one, not even to her, his eyes fixed straight ahead, his phone glued to his ear as he gave sharp instructions to someone unseen. Then the door to his office clicked shut behind him, and Victoria released a breath she didn't realize she was holding. It was always like that, predictable, controlled, cold. She admired his brilliance, even as she feared his silence. At 10:30 sharp, the conference room came alive with executives. The meeting was one of those weekly rituals where everyone fought for Dominic's approval and prayed not to draw his criticism. Victoria sat quietly in a corner, typing notes, catching every word. Her job wasn't to speak, it was to observe, to anticipate, to ensure nothing went wrong. The room buzzed with tension as presentations flashed across the screen. One small error, a single miscalculated figure, changed the temperature of the room in an instant. Dominic's voice dropped lower, colder. "Who prepared this report?" he asked quietly. The question froze everyone. The department head stammered before pointing toward Victoria. She compiled the final version. "Sir," all eyes turned toward her. Victoria's pulse quickened. She knew exactly what happened. The finance department had sent her an incorrect file, one she had already flagged by email, but no one had replied. Yet explaining that now would sound like an excuse. She met Dominic's sharp gaze and said softly, "Sir, the figures were provided by finance, but I can double-check the original data." Dominic leaned back, his tone clipped. "I don't need explanations, I need accuracy. If you're responsible for compiling something, it must be perfect, no exceptions." The words cut through her like ice. She nodded silently, refusing to let emotion show. It was not the first time she'd taken the blame for someone else's mistake. When the meeting ended, whispers filled the hallway. "Don't take it personally," one junior executive murmured. "He treats everyone like that, but Victoria knew better. He didn't treat everyone like that. He only treated the invisible ones that way, the ones too quiet to fight back." The day dragged on. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she typed summaries and responded to endless emails. Her stomach grumbled, but she ignored it. Lunch breaks were luxuries she rarely allowed herself. The office was a place of constant motion, where empathy had no space between the spreadsheets and strategies. By evening, her fingers ached. But her reports were flawless. Her reward was silence. Dominic left for his dinner meeting without so much as a thank you. That night, in her small apartment overlooking the city, Victoria sat by the window with a cup of tea. The lights below shimmered like stars trapped in glass. She watched them and wondered how many of those people felt invisible, too. She wasn't unhappy, not exactly. She was simply unseen, like a song no one hears. A painting hidden in the dark, she thought of leaving, of finding work where her effort mattered. But the truth was, she needed this job. Her parents had sacrificed everything to send her to university. And the salary she earned here paid for their medicine, their comfort, their dignity. So she endured. Because that's what invisible people do. They endure quietly. The next morning started like all others. The same elevator, the same faces, the same rhythm of keys clicking and phones ringing, until she reached her desk and stopped. There, resting beside her computer, was a bouquet of white roses. The petals looked soft, almost glowing in the morning light. A small card peeked out from between the flowers. Her breath caught as she opened it. The message read in neat handwriting, "Thank you for your help yesterday. It made all the difference, Cameron." Cameron Hayes had joined Ashford Enterprises only a week ago as the new director of business development. He was different from the others. He smiled when he greeted people. He listened when they spoke. He had a way of making people feel seen. And now, apparently, he had noticed her too for a moment. Victoria simply stared at the flowers, unsure how to react. No one had ever sent her flowers before, not at work, not in her life. Her cheeks warmed, and her heart fluttered with something she hadn't felt in years, being appreciated. Around her, murmurs began to ripple through the office. A few curious glances, some teasing smiles. Victoria quickly placed the bouquet to the side, trying to hide it behind her monitor. But before she could, Dominic's office door opened. He stepped out, his phone in hand, ready to give another command. His gaze landed on the bouquet, and for a brief, unguarded moment, something flickered in his expression, surprise, confusion, and something else, something darker. The air seemed to tighten. He looked at Victoria, his voice suddenly sharper. "When you're done admiring your new decorations, I need the Patterson contract reviewed in the next hour." His words were calm, but his tone carried a cold edge that made the back of her neck prickle. She nodded quickly, hiding the card inside her drawer. As he walked back into his office, she caught a glimpse of his reflection in the glass, his jaw tight, his shoulders rigid. He closed the door a little harder than usual at lunchtime. Cameron appeared by her desk holding 2 cups of coffee. "I noticed you usually skip lunch," he said casually. "I thought you might at least accept caffeine." She smiled faintly. "You've been observing me, Mr. Hayes." "Just enough to see that you're the busiest person in this office," he said warmly. "And by the way, you don't have to thank me for the flowers. You helped me navigate the entire company system yesterday. You saved me from missing a major client deadline. I just wanted to say thanks properly. It was simple, genuine, kind." From inside his glass-walled office, Dominic looked up. His eyes locked on the scene outside. Cameron leaning on her desk, Victoria laughing softly. The sound of her laughter reached him faintly. A melody he had never heard before, and suddenly it unsettled him. He told himself it was irrelevant, that he had more important things to focus on. But every time she smiled, every time Cameron appeared near her desk, his attention drifted for the first time in years. Dominic Ashford was distracted. He found himself glancing toward the flowers, toward her, toward the quiet corner of the office that had never mattered before. He began noticing details, the neat way she arranged her files, the small notebook she always carried, the faint scent of lavender that lingered near her desk. He realized how many times she had anticipated his needs before he spoke, how her efficiency had kept his company flawless. He had never once said thank you, never once asked about her life. The next few days blurred into a rhythm of subtle changes. Cameron made everyone laugh. His presence seemed to brighten the office. He often stopped by Victoria's desk, sometimes to ask for data, sometimes just to share a story. And though she tried to remain professional, her face softened when he spoke. There was warmth in her eyes, a light Dominic had never seen before, and each time he saw it, something inside him tightened. He began to question himself in ways he never had. Why did it bother him? Why did it matter if she smiled at someone else? She was just an employee, an assistant, replaceable like any other. Yet, no matter how he reasoned, his heart refused to listen. He started to find excuses to walk past her desk, asking for updates he didn't need, giving instructions that could have waited. Sometimes their eyes met, and for a second she hesitated, confused by his sudden attention, but before she could speak, he would retreat into his office again. Slamming the door, the staff began to notice. The energy in the office shifted subtly. They whispered about the flowers, about Cameron's interest, about the boss's uncharacteristic moods. Victoria tried to ignore it, focusing instead on her work. But she could feel it too. Dominic's gaze lingering a little too long, his voice tight whenever Cameron was near. On Friday evening, when most of the office had already left, Victoria stayed behind to finish a report. The city outside glowed with the soft shimmer of twilight. Dominic's office light was still on, as always. He lived there. It seemed more than anywhere else. As she packed her things, she noticed movement through the glass wall. Dominic was standing by the window, his hands in his pockets, his reflection blending with the city lights. He looked lonely, not in the way of someone without company, but in the way of someone who had forgotten what connection felt like. For a long moment, she simply watched. Then she turned off her computer, gathered her bag, and left quietly. The flowers had wilted slightly. Their once bright petals curling inward, she replaced the water in the vase before leaving. Smiling faintly, they had been a small kindness, a reminder that she was still visible, still human, still capable of being noticed. Inside his office, Dominic watched her through the reflection in the glass, watched as she cared for the dying roses with gentle hands, watched as she smiled softly before turning away. And something inside him shifted, a realization he couldn't yet name but could no longer deny. For the first time in years, the master of control felt something slipping beyond his reach. Not a deal, not a company, not a fortune, but a person. Someone he had ignored for far too long, someone he could no longer ignore. He turned from the window, his chest tight, his thoughts louder than the city below. The night stretched long and restless, and for the first time, Dominic Ashford wondered if his empire of glass and steel had cost him more than he ever intended to lose. Flowers on the desk. The following Monday unfolded beneath a silver-gray sky, the kind that made the city feel heavier, as if the weight of ambition hung in the clouds above. Inside Ashford Enterprises, the rhythm of the office began as usual, phones ringing, keyboards tapping, the scent of coffee mingling with perfume and printer ink. Yet for Victoria Chen, something subtle had shifted. She still arrived first, still organized Dominic's day with flawless precision. But there was a quiet strength in her now, a sense of lightness that no one could quite name. Her desk, as always, was perfectly arranged, the reports stacked by deadline, the files aligned in neat symmetry. But beside her monitor stood a small potted orchid, its petals a deep violet that seemed almost royal against the sterile glass and steel surroundings. It had arrived that morning with a simple note from Cameron Hayes. Thought your desk could use something that doesn't require constant approval to bloom. The line made her laugh softly, a small sound that carried warmth into the cold corridors of efficiency. When Dominic entered the office that morning, his gaze caught the orchid almost immediately. The sight of it sitting so proudly on Victoria's desk hit him with an emotion he couldn't define. He paused mid-step, his hand tightening around his phone. His eyes flickered briefly toward her. She was bent slightly forward, adjusting the leaves, her expression peaceful in a way he had never seen before. Something inside him clenched. Sharp and unfamiliar, a tension he refused to name. He walked past her without a word, his steps too quick. The air around him strangely charged. Inside his office, Dominic closed the door. But instead of turning to his computer, he remained still, staring at his reflection in the glass wall. The orchid haunted him, Not because it was just a plant, but because of what it represented. It was a symbol of appreciation, of warmth, of being seen. All the things he had withheld for years without even realizing it. For the first time in his life, he found himself distracted not by a business crisis, but by the image of an assistant smiling over flowers. As the day progressed, he tried to focus on his work, but his concentration shattered every time laughter echoed softly from Victoria's desk. He could hear Cameron's voice occasionally, low and easy, the kind of tone Dominic had never mastered. The way they spoke carried a familiarity that unsettled him deeply. Cameron called her by her first name without hesitation. While Dominic had never done so, she seemed different around Cameron, brighter, freer, and the realization burned. By lunchtime, the tension within Dominic had begun to simmer. He called for Victoria, his tone clipped. She entered his office quickly, tablet in hand, ready for instructions. Her professionalism never wavered, but Dominic noticed a softness in her demeanor that hadn't been there before. She stood a little straighter. Her voice carried more confidence. He told himself it was irrelevant, that he needed to focus on work, not her sudden self-assurance. Yet he couldn't stop noticing the difference. "Reschedule the investor call to tomorrow morning," he said sharply, his voice too firm for the simple request, "and confirm the site visit for the Madison project." "Yes, Mr. Ashford," she replied, typing swiftly, then added gently, "Would you like me to notify the board of the time change?" He looked up sharply, the question simple yet her tone somehow disarming. "Of course," he said, but his voice sounded almost distant. "That's all?" She turned to leave, and just as she reached the door, he spoke again. "Miss Chen," she paused. "Yes, sir?" His mouth opened, then closed again. He didn't know what he wanted to say, perhaps something like, "You're doing well," or "I noticed your new orchid." But the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he muttered, "That'll be all." The rest of the day passed in unease. Cameron stopped by Victoria's desk several times. Each visit wrapped in easy smiles and shared stories. He brought her coffee in the afternoon, handing it to her like a familiar ritual. "Double shot, 2 sugars, right?" he asked, and she laughed softly. "You've been paying attention." Dominic heard that exchange through the glass. The simple familiarity in her laughter stirred something raw inside him. He slammed his pen down and stared blankly at his documents, the numbers blurring before his eyes. By the time evening settled, most of the office had emptied. Only a few lights remained glowing like small fires in the dark. Victoria sat typing quietly, her orchid catching the faint glow from her desk lamp. Cameron stopped by her desk again, jacket slung over his shoulder. "You should head home, Victoria," he said, his tone casual but caring. "It's almost 9. She smiled faintly. "I'll just finish this proposal draft, Mr. Hayes." "Cameron," he corrected softly. "You can call me Cameron," she hesitated, unused to such informality. Then slowly she nodded. "All right, Cameron," she said, her voice carrying a small warmth that lingered in the air. From his office, Dominic watched this entire exchange. The words muted, but the expressions painfully clear. Cameron's relaxed charm, Victoria's shy smile. It all made Dominic feel like an intruder in a world that used to orbit him alone. For years, his office had been the center of control, of command, and yet, in this quiet moment, he felt utterly powerless. He told himself it was nothing, that her personal life wasn't his concern, but jealousy had no interest in logic. It crept through him like slow fire. That night, Dominic stayed long after everyone had left. The building was silent, the only sound the low hum of the air conditioning. He stared at the orchid through the glass, still glowing faintly under the desk lamp. His reflection overlapped it, his face cold, distant, and tired. He realized he had built an empire that recognized every profit margin, every contract, but not the people who kept it alive, especially her. The next morning began tensely. Dominic arrived earlier than usual, catching Victoria off guard as she prepared the day's agenda. She greeted him politely, her smile brief, but the orchid on her desk still stood proudly, its purple petals unfolding wider than before. For reasons he didn't want to admit, it annoyed him. The plant felt like a rival presence, a reminder of something he could not give. When Cameron arrived, the atmosphere in the office changed again. His easy laughter filled the room, and Victoria's expression brightened instantly. They exchanged a few quiet words before heading to the meeting room together. Their camaraderie was effortless. While Dominic's silence had always been a wall, he watched them go, the sight igniting a bitterness that surprised him. He wasn't used to feeling second to anyone, least of all in his own office. During the team meeting that morning, tension simmered beneath the polished professionalism. Cameron presented a new proposal. Innovative, risky, but impressive. Victoria assisted him, clicking through slides and providing data like a silent partner. Every time she spoke, Dominic found his gaze drawn to her. She wasn't the quiet, hesitant assistant anymore. There was confidence in her now, a quiet authority. The room noticed it too, and that realization struck him harder than he expected. When the presentation ended, the team applauded lightly. Dominic's expression remained unreadable. He leaned back in his chair, his voice calm but sharp. "Impressive work, Cameron," he said slowly, "though I see my assistant has been quite involved in your department lately." The room fell silent. Cameron met his gaze evenly. Victoria's insights have been invaluable. She knows the internal operations better than anyone. Dominic's jaw tightened. That may be true, but she has other responsibilities. I wouldn't want her to be distracted. The words hung heavy in the air, and Victoria felt the weight of them press against her chest. She lowered her gaze, murmuring, "I only provided support." "Mr. Ashford," Cameron's tone softened, but his eyes flashed with quiet defiance. "Support that made this proposal possible." The unspoken challenge in his voice was unmistakable. The room grew cold. For a long moment, Dominic said nothing. Then, with a tight smile, he simply said, "Meeting adjourned," after everyone left. Victoria remained, quietly collecting documents. Dominic's voice stopped her. "Miss Chen," she turned slowly. "Yes, sir?" He studied her face, his expression conflicted. "Be careful where you invest your time," he said quietly. "Some people mistake friendliness for opportunity." She blinked, confusion and hurt flashing briefly in her eyes. "With respect, sir, Mr. Hayes has been nothing but professional." Dominic didn't reply. His silence said everything. She nodded once, holding her composure, and left the room. But the echo of his words lingered long after she was gone. The following days unfolded in strange tension. Dominic tried to return to his usual rhythm, meetings, deals, expansion plans, but his focus was fractured. He noticed small things he had ignored for years. The way Victoria greeted people with genuine warmth. The way her voice softened when helping a colleague. The way her presence seemed to make the entire office calmer. He realized, with growing discomfort, that she was the quiet heartbeat of everything he had built. One afternoon, he passed her desk as she spoke softly with Cameron. Her laughter rose again, unguarded and bright, and something inside Dominic snapped. "Miss Chen," he said sharply, and the tone made the room still. She straightened instantly. "Yes, sir?" "I need the quarterly report corrected now," he said. Handing her a file, she glanced at it briefly. "Sir, this is already finalized. We submitted it last week." "Then unfinalize it," he said curtly. "Apparently there's always room for improvement." She hesitated for just a second before nodding. "Of course, Mr. Ashford." Cameron's expression hardened, but he said nothing. Still, the message in his eyes was clear. Dominic saw it, and it only deepened the storm within him. That evening, Victoria worked late again, alone in the office. She felt the tension pressing down on her like invisible weight. She didn't understand why Dominic's behavior had changed so suddenly. He had always been strict, but lately there was something personal beneath his sharpness, something almost wounded. She finished the revisions he demanded and left the file on his desk. Her orchid caught her eye as she prepared to leave. The petals glowed softly in the dim light. Delicate yet enduring, she smiled faintly. Brushing one with her fingertip in his office, Dominic watched from the doorway, unseen. His chest ached with something unfamiliar. He wanted to speak, to apologize, to ask her why she had never said anything all those years when he failed to notice her worth, but the words stayed locked inside. He had lived so long as a man of control that vulnerability now felt like exposure. He turned away before she could see him, his reflection disappearing into the darkness. That night, when Victoria left the building, Dominic remained, staring at the orchid once again. His empire, his achievements, his discipline, all of it suddenly felt empty beside that small living thing that someone else had given her. The jealousy he refused to admit to himself was no longer quiet. It pulsed in his chest with every beat of his heart. For the first time, Dominic Ashford understood what it meant to fear losing something he never even realized he wanted. The crack in his world, the city awakened under the soft glow of morning. But for Dominic Ashford, dawn brought no calm. He had spent a restless night turning in his penthouse apartment, haunted by thoughts he didn't understand. Thoughts of laughter that wasn't his, of a woman he'd barely noticed for years now living rent-free in his mind. For a man whose world had always been ruled by logic, the intrusion of emotion felt like chaos. He stared out across the skyline from his balcony, the wind tugging at his shirt sleeves. Below him stretched the kingdom he had built, steel, glass, power. And yet all he could think about was one small orchid sitting on an assistant's desk. By the time he arrived at the office, the building hummed with life. Victoria was already there. As always, her focus precise, her expression calm. But something had changed in her eyes, an independence, a quiet assurance that drew attention from others. Dominic noticed that people greeted her now, smiled at her, engaged with her ideas. She was no longer the silent shadow that existed on the periphery. She was becoming visible, and somehow that visibility unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Cameron was standing by her desk when Dominic entered, showing her a new proposal draft. They were laughing softly, heads close together. Cameron's hand resting casually on the edge of her desk, Dominic's jaw tightened instantly. He felt a pulse of irritation he couldn't disguise. The sight was perfectly innocent. Yet to him, it burned like a challenge. He walked past them without a word. But the tension in his stride was impossible to miss. The door to his office closed with a harder click than necessary. Inside, Dominic tried to drown himself in work. But numbers and contracts meant nothing today. His thoughts kept drifting to the woman just outside his door. For years, she had been invisible to him, an efficient machine that kept his empire running. But now that someone else saw her, truly saw her, he couldn't stop noticing everything he'd ignored. The way her hair framed her face when she bent over her keyboard, the gentle tone of her voice when she spoke to clients, the quiet kindness that softened even the harshest corners of this corporate world. It infuriated him because it shouldn't matter. He told himself she was an employee, one among hundreds, replaceable. Yet when he caught a glimpse of her smiling through the glass wall, his heart reacted in ways that logic could not contain. The emotion that clawed its way through him wasn't professional concern, it was jealousy, raw and unfamiliar. That afternoon, a board meeting filled the executive suite. The air was thick with tension even before the meeting began. Dominic entered the room, his presence commanding as always. But there was an edge to him today. The others noticed it, the clipped tone, the restlessness in his movements. Victoria sat at the far end, quietly recording minutes, while Cameron prepared to present a progress update. When Cameron began to speak, the room seemed to lean toward him. His presentation was polished, confident, visionary. He spoke of expansion and innovation. His ideas bold yet practical, Victoria assisted seamlessly, flipping slides, clarifying figures. Their teamwork was evident, their rhythm synchronized. Dominic watched the exchange in silence, his expression unreadable, but inside, his emotions twisted like wires. "Excellent presentation. Mr. Hayes," one of the directors said. "And I must say, Miss Chen, your data analysis was remarkably thorough." Victoria blinked in surprise. Unused to being addressed directly in a boardroom full of executives. "Thank you," she said softly. Her cheeks warmed. And Cameron gave her an encouraging smile. Dominic's fingers tapped against the table, a faint rhythm of restrained irritation. "Indeed," he said finally, his voice smooth but cold. Although perhaps Miss Chen should remember that her primary role is administrative support, not strategic analysis. The room fell silent. Cameron's smile faded. And Victoria looked down, her pulse quickened. The familiar sting of humiliation she thought she'd outgrown tightening her chest. "With respect, sir," Cameron said calmly, Her analysis directly contributed to the projection's accuracy. I would consider that strategic contribution, not overreach. Dominic's eyes flicked toward him sharply, a silent warning flashing there. Noted, he said curtly, but this is still my meeting, and I decide what qualifies as contribution. The conversation moved on, but the damage was done. Victoria's confidence trembled beneath the weight of his words, and Dominic hated himself for it. He hadn't meant to hurt her, not truly, but something inside him refused to tolerate how easily she now belonged in someone else's world. When the meeting ended, the room emptied quickly. Leaving only the three of them, Victoria gathered her notes silently. Avoiding both men's eyes, Cameron turned to Dominic. His tone polite but edged. That was unnecessary, he said. She didn't deserve that. Dominic looked up from his papers, his expression cold. And you presume to tell me how to manage my staff now, Mr. Hayes? I'm saying there's a difference between management and disrespect, Cameron replied evenly. She's earned more than that, for a moment. Neither man moved. The silence was heavy, thick with unspoken truths. Then Dominic said quietly, Be careful, Hayes. You're overstepping. Victoria's voice broke the tension, soft but steady. It's all right, she said, gathering her things. Please, both of you. There's no need. But as she turned to leave, her hands trembled slightly. Cameron gave her a reassuring nod. Dominic watched her go, a hollow ache spreading in his chest. Later that evening, when the office emptied and shadows stretched across the floor, Dominic called her name. Miss Chen. His voice carried through the quiet air. She hesitated at the doorway before stepping inside. Yes, Mr. Ashford? He gestured toward the chair opposite his desk. Sit. She sat carefully, her back straight, tablet resting in her lap. He looked at her for a long moment, searching for words that refused to come. Finally, he said, You've been working here for nearly 5 years, haven't you? Yes, sir. 4 years and 7 months, she replied softly. Is there a problem with my performance? He shook his head. No, your performance is flawless. Always has been. He paused, his tone softening slightly. You're efficient, reliable, dependable? Victoria waited, her heart uneasy. Then what is this about? Dominic turned toward the window, the city's lights flickering behind his reflection. I've noticed changes lately, he said. You seem different. Different how, sir? More confident, more visible. His voice trailed. It's like you've become someone else. Victoria's expression remained composed, though her pulse quickened. Perhaps I just stopped hiding, she said quietly. After years of being unseen, it's liberating to realize I don't have to disappear to be valuable. Her words struck him deeper than she realized. He turned back to face her. You think I made you disappear? I think you never cared enough to notice I was here, she replied gently. You noticed my mistakes, not my efforts. You heard my reports, not my voice. He flinched inwardly, but said nothing. She continued, Mr. Ashford, I respect you. I've learned so much working for you, but respect shouldn't come at the cost of self-worth. I'm not asking for validation. I'm just saying I've spent years in your shadow, and I'm done living invisible. For a long moment, silence filled the room. Dominic wanted to speak, to explain that he hadn't meant to make her feel unseen, that he had built his empire by erasing emotion because it made him weak. He wanted to tell her that every time she smiled at Cameron, something inside him cracked, because it reminded him of everything he had missed. But the words never came. Instead, he said coldly, Are you implying I've mistreated you? Victoria rose slowly, her expression calm but her eyes shining with restrained emotion. I'm not implying anything, sir. I'm telling you how I feel, she said. And for once, I'm not apologizing for it. Dominic's throat tightened. He wanted to stop her, but pride chained his voice. She nodded politely. Good night, Mr. Ashford, and left his office. The door closed softly behind her, yet its echo lingered in his mind like thunder. He remained seated long after she was gone. The city lights blurred beyond the glass as his reflection stared back at him. A man surrounded by success, but empty inside. He realized with painful clarity that his life had become a fortress, and he was its only prisoner. In the days that followed, Dominic tried to return to normalcy, but normal no longer existed. Victoria carried herself differently now. She spoke in meetings with confidence. Her colleagues listened. Cameron treated her as an equal. The office had begun to see her the way Dominic never did. Every smile she gave someone else felt like another crack forming in the foundation of the world he once controlled. One afternoon, he walked out of his office and stopped mid-stride. Through the glass, he saw Cameron hand her a document, their fingers brushing slightly as they exchanged papers. It was innocent, barely a touch, but it ignited something fierce in him, a flash of jealousy so intense he almost didn't recognize himself. He turned abruptly and stormed back into his office, the door slamming behind him with a sound that made the entire floor go silent. Victoria looked toward his office door. Her expression troubled. She didn't understand his anger. Not fully, but she could feel its weight. For the first time in years, she pitied him. Not as her boss, but as a man trapped by his own walls. That night, Dominic sat alone at his desk. His tie loosened, his hands pressed against his face. The office was dark, the orchid outside his door glowing faintly in the lamplight. He thought of all the times he'd chosen silence over gratitude, control over connection, pride over empathy, and now those choices stood before him, embodied in the one woman he could no longer ignore. He whispered her name softly, as if the sound itself could ease the ache in his chest. But the empty room offered no reply. In that stillness, Dominic Ashford finally understood the truth he had spent a lifetime avoiding. The world he built had no cracks because it had no heart. And the first fracture in his empire wasn't weakness, it was her. When love finds its voice. The city glimmered beneath a velvet sky as Olivia Carter stood by the window of her apartment, her reflection framed against the distant sea of lights. She had thought peace would return once Derek's schemes unraveled and truth restored her reputation. Yet peace felt different now, quieter, deeper, yet uncertain, as if her heart was learning to beat to a new rhythm. Months had passed since that night on the terrace when Julian Harrington's words had brushed the edges of a confession, leaving her heart trembling between gratitude and something far stronger. They had grown closer through shared purpose and silent understanding, bound by more than partnership. What lived between them was something unspoken but undeniable, a current that seemed to hum beneath every conversation, every look, every shared silence. Her work had flourished. The literacy initiative had expanded beyond anything she had dared to dream. 10 centers across the country, scholarships for hundreds of children, and recognition from international organizations that once overlooked her. Yet behind every success, she felt Julian's quiet presence, always encouraging, always lifting her higher, never asking for anything in return. He was there in every triumph, never taking credit, never letting her forget that she had done this by her own strength. But Olivia knew what her heart refused to voice. His belief in her had become the heartbeat of her courage. That evening, she received a call from him. His tone was calm, though beneath it she sensed something different, an almost hesitant warmth. "I'm hosting a small event tomorrow," Julian said. "Just friends, colleagues, people who've supported our projects. I'd like you to come. It wouldn't feel right without you there." Olivia hesitated only briefly before agreeing. The next night arrived, wrapped in the shimmer of late spring. The Harrington estate, though grand, carried a warmth unlike the Ashford mansion that had once suffocated her. The lights were soft, the air filled with laughter and music that felt genuine, not performative. Olivia entered wearing a midnight blue gown that flowed like water, simple yet radiant. Conversations paused as she stepped in, not from gossip this time, but from admiration. Not for beauty alone, but for the quiet confidence she carried now. Julian noticed her immediately. For a moment, he forgot the crowd around him, forgot the music, forgot every pretense of composure. She looked breathtaking, but more than that, she looked free. As she approached, he extended his hand with a smile that reached his eyes. "You came," he said softly. "You asked," she replied, her tone teasing but gentle. "I'm saying there's a difference between management and disrespect," Cameron replied evenly. "She's earned more than that." For a moment, Neither man moved. The silence was heavy, thick with unspoken truths. Then Dominic said quietly, "Be careful, Hayes." "You're overstepping." Victoria's voice broke the tension, soft but steady. "It's all right," she said, gathering her things. "Please, both of you. There's no need." But as she turned to leave, her hands trembled slightly. Cameron gave her a reassuring nod. Dominic watched her go, a hollow ache spreading in his chest. Later that evening, when the office emptied and shadows stretched across the floor, Dominic called her name, "Miss Chen." His voice carried through the quiet air. She hesitated at the doorway before stepping inside. "Yes, Mr. Ashford?" He gestured toward the chair opposite his desk. "Sit." She sat carefully, her back straight, tablet resting in her lap. He looked at her for a long moment, searching for words that refused to come. Finally, he said, "You've been working here for nearly 5 years, haven't you?" "Yes, sir. 4 years and 7 months," she replied softly. "Is there a problem with my performance?" He shook his head. "No, your performance is flawless. Always has been." He paused, his tone softening slightly. "You're efficient, reliable, dependable." Victoria waited, her heart uneasy. "Then what is this about?" Dominic turned toward the window, the city's lights flickering behind his reflection. "I've noticed changes lately," he said. "You seem different." "Different how, sir?" "More confident, more visible." His voice trailed. "It's like you've become someone else." Victoria's expression remained composed, though her pulse quickened. "Perhaps I just stopped hiding," she said quietly. "After years of being unseen, it's liberating to realize I don't have to disappear to be valuable." Her words struck him deeper than she realized. He turned back to face her. "You think I made you disappear?" "I think you never cared enough to notice I was here," she replied gently. "You noticed my mistakes, not my efforts. You heard my reports, not my voice." He flinched inwardly but said nothing. She continued, "Mr. Ashford, I respect you. I've learned so much working for you, but respect shouldn't come at the cost of self-worth. I'm not asking for validation, I'm just saying, I've spent years in your shadow, and I'm done living invisible." For a long moment, silence filled the room. Dominic wanted to speak, to explain that he hadn't meant to make her feel unseen, that he had built his empire by erasing emotion because it made him weak. He wanted to tell her that every time she smiled at Cameron, something inside him cracked because it reminded him of everything he had missed. But the words never came. Instead, he said coldly, "Are you implying I've mistreated you?" Victoria rose slowly, her expression calm, but her eyes shining with restrained emotion. "I'm not implying anything, sir. I'm telling you how I feel," she said. "And for once, I'm not apologizing for it." Dominic's throat tightened. He wanted to stop her, but pride chained his voice. She nodded politely. "Good night, Mr. Ashford," and left his office. The door closed softly behind her, yet its echo lingered in his mind like thunder. He remained seated long after she was gone. The city lights blurred beyond the glass as his reflection stared back at him, a man surrounded by success, but empty inside. He realized with painful clarity that his life had become a fortress, and he was its only prisoner. In the days that followed, Dominic tried to return to normalcy, but normal no longer existed. Victoria carried herself differently now. She spoke in meetings with confidence. Her colleagues listened. Cameron treated her as an equal. The office had begun to see her the way Dominic never did. Every smile she gave someone else felt like another crack forming in the foundation of the world he once controlled. One afternoon, he walked out of his office and stopped mid-stride. Through the glass, he saw Cameron hand her a document, their fingers brushing slightly as they exchanged papers. It was innocent, barely a touch, but it ignited something fierce in him. A flash of jealousy so intense he almost didn't recognize himself. He turned abruptly and stormed back into his office, the door slamming behind him with a sound that made the entire floor go silent. Victoria looked toward his office door, her expression troubled. She didn't understand his anger. Not fully, but she could feel its weight. For the first time in years, she pitied him. Not as her boss, but as a man trapped by his own walls. That night, Dominic sat alone at his desk. His tie loosened, his hands pressed against his face. The office was dark. the orchid outside his door glowing faintly in the lamplight. He thought of all the times he'd chosen silence over gratitude, control over connection, pride over empathy, and now those choices stood before him. Embodied in the one woman he could no longer ignore, he whispered her name softly, as if the sound itself could ease the ache in his chest. But the empty room offered no reply. In that stillness, Dominic Ashford finally understood the truth he had spent a lifetime avoiding. The world he built had no cracks because it had no heart, and the first fracture in his empire wasn't weakness, it was her. The confession no one expected. The rain came that Thursday morning, soft and steady, washing the city in a sheen of silver. Ashford Enterprises loomed against the gray skyline, its glass walls reflecting the storm's light like trembling mirrors. Inside, the usual rhythm of keyboards and footsteps filled the air. Yet beneath it, something unspoken simmered, an awareness, a shift, as though everyone could sense the fragile thread stretched taut between Dominic Ashford and Victoria Chen. Victoria sat at her desk, focused on the screen before her, but her mind drifted. Her heart no longer trembled under Dominic's sharp commands. Instead, there was calm resolve within her. She had spent years fading into the background, her worth hidden behind efficiency, but something in her had awakened. She was tired of blending into silence, tired of letting her identity exist only through someone else's schedule. Cameron had reminded her that she could be more, not because he gave her confidence, but because he helped her remember she already had it. Across the hall, Dominic watched her through the glass wall, his reflection overlapping hers like a ghost. The distance between them was only a few meters, yet it felt like a world apart. He hadn't spoken to her properly in days. Each time he tried, the words failed him. Every attempt at control made him sound harsher, colder, and the more he pushed, the more she retreated. The realization was unbearable. For a man who had built an empire on decisiveness, this helplessness was unfamiliar and humiliating. Cameron entered then, his presence bright even under the dim weather. He leaned lightly on Victoria's desk, speaking to her with an easy smile. She laughed softly at something he said, a laugh that reached Dominic like a whisper through glass. He clenched his jaw. The sound of her laughter, once a melody he'd ignored, now haunted him. Because it wasn't his to hear anymore. Minutes later, Cameron placed a small folder on her desk. "Lunch today?" he asked warmly. "My treat." Victoria hesitated, glancing toward Dominic's office instinctively, then quickly shook her head at her own reaction. "Sure," she said. "Why not?" Her smile was genuine, unburdened, and Dominic, though he couldn't hear their words, could read their expressions perfectly. He felt something deep inside his chest twist. He rose suddenly, grabbing his coat, and walked past them without a glance. His movements were clipped, too controlled to be casual. He muttered something to his secretary about a meeting and disappeared down the corridor. For the first time in his career, Dominic canceled his own appointments. He couldn't sit through another boardroom conversation while that ache in his chest grew sharper. He drove aimlessly through the rain-washed streets, the rhythmic tap of raindrops against the windshield the only sound in the car. He didn't understand what he was doing, but every mile seemed to make the truth clearer. He was running, not from them, but from himself. He parked near the waterfront. Stepping out beneath the steady drizzle, the air smelled of salt and rain. The city lights shimmered across the wet pavement like fractured stars. Dominic stared at his reflection in a puddle, the powerful, composed man he'd built himself to be. But behind that mask he saw someone hollow, someone terrified of being seen for what he was, a man who didn't know how to love. Not because he didn't feel it, but because he never learned how to show it. He thought of Victoria's quiet patience, her grace, the way she never demanded recognition, and yet she gave everything she had. He thought of the loneliness in her eyes that once mirrored his own, and how, when Cameron arrived, that loneliness had begun to fade. She was changing, growing, and he, Dominic Ashford, was the one left behind by the time he returned to the office. The day had stretched into evening. The rain had stopped, leaving streaks on the windows like traces of emotion too heavy to contain. The lights were dim, the building nearly empty. Victoria was still there, typing quietly. the soft hum of the desk lamp illuminating her face. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her. Then, before he could lose his nerve, he said her name, not Miss Chen, but softly, Victoria. She froze, startled. Her hands paused over the keyboard. Slowly, she turned. Her expression neutral, professional, but her heart skipped. He rarely said her name, and when he did, it always carried weight. Yes, Mr. Ashford? He hesitated, his voice trembling slightly. Because I can't ignore it anymore, he said. I can't ignore the way the office feels empty when you're not there, the way my days fall apart without your calm. I can't ignore the way I've started to see you everywhere I look. She took a slow breath. Dominic, she said gently, you're confusing gratitude with emotion. You're used to control, so when someone breaks through that, it feels like chaos, but that's not love. That's guilt mixed with discovery. Her words hit him like a truth he'd been avoiding. He looked at her, pain flickering in his expression. Maybe you're right, he said quietly. Maybe I don't even know what love is anymore. But when I see you with him, when I see you smile at someone else, it feels like the ground beneath me disappears. The honesty in his tone broke something inside her. That's not fair, she whispered. You had years to see me, to value me, and you chose not to. You don't get to claim me now because someone else noticed what you wouldn't. He closed his eyes, the truth cutting deeper than her words. I know, he said, but I'm not trying to claim you. I just needed to tell you what I never had the courage to admit. You changed me, Victoria, without even trying. You made me see how blind I've been. The room fell silent. The city lights reflected faintly on the glass walls. Painting soft gold across her face, she looked at him. At the man who once frightened her, now standing before her humbled and uncertain. A part of her wanted to believe him, to let the apology heal the wounds. But another part knew better. Change takes more than words. You've spent your life chasing perfection, she said softly. But people aren't projects, Dominic. They don't stay fixed. They grow or they leave, and when they grow, you can't keep them in the box where they used to fit. He looked at her then. Truly looked, and for the first time in his life, he didn't see an assistant. He saw a woman of quiet strength, one who had learned to stand on her own after years of being unseen. And the realization both broke and freed him. Is it too late? He asked finally, his voice low. Almost childlike, she hesitated, her heart twisting. It's never too late to become better, she said. But sometimes it's too late to undo the distance you created. Her words lingered in the air like soft rain. He nodded slowly, accepting the truth he couldn't fight. Then let me start there, he said. Not as your boss, not as someone trying to fix what's broken, but as someone who finally wants to listen. For a moment, neither spoke. The sound of the rain against the glass filled the silence. She looked at him, saw the sincerity in his eyes, and though forgiveness wouldn't come easily, something inside her softened. She gave him a small, sad smile. Listening would be a good start, she said. But Dominic, you have to understand. I'm not the same person you ignored. I know, he whispered, and that's what terrifies me the most. When she left his office that night, Dominic stood there long after, staring at the empty space where she'd stood. He didn't chase her, didn't call her back. He simply let her walk away, because for once, he understood that holding on wasn't the same as caring. Outside, the rain had stopped. The city shimmered under the streetlights. And somewhere in that vastness, two hearts beat with the weight of change. One learning to heal from invisibility, the other learning how to finally see. When the invisible became irreplaceable, the morning broke soft and gold after nights of rain, sunlight pooling across the wide windows of Ashford Enterprises like forgiveness, finding its way through glass. For the first time in months, the air in the office felt light, not because tension had vanished, but because something inside it had shifted. People spoke more gently, smiles came easier, and though no one said it aloud, they sensed that the storm between Dominic Ashford and Victoria Chen had forced the building itself to breathe again. Victoria arrived early as always, her calm footsteps echoing across the marble floor. She carried a quiet confidence that didn't ask for notice but commanded respect anyway. The orchid still sat on her desk, its petals now fully open. A small living reminder that even delicate things can bloom in the coldest places. She paused to touch one leaf lightly, feeling peace instead of fear. She had forgiven him, not with words, but with the decision to keep living her truth. Dominic entered a little later than usual. He was no longer the man who swept through hallways like a gust of authority. There was something different in his stride. Slower, thoughtful. The last few days had carved humility into him. He'd spent long nights staring at city lights, asking himself what kind of empire meant anything if it left no room for humanity. He stopped near her desk, and the moment hung quiet. "Good morning." "Victoria?" he said deliberately, without the mask of formality. She looked up, surprised for only a second, then smiled faintly. "Good morning, Mr. Ashford," she replied. He hesitated, then said gently, "Dominic," and the sound of his own name spoken that way. Open, uncertain, human, felt like the first honest word he'd said in years. That day passed differently. Meetings were calmer, discussions more collaborative. Dominic listened instead of commanding. He asked questions, invited opinions, thanked people sincerely. The staff exchanged quiet glances of disbelief. For the first time, their leader seemed reachable. Victoria noticed it all with cautious admiration. It wasn't transformation overnight, but it was real. At lunch, Cameron appeared as usual, 2 coffees in hand. He smiled at Victoria. "Break time. You owe me 15 minutes away from your screen." She laughed softly. 15 minutes. "No more." They walked to the rooftop terrace where the air smelled of rain and concrete. "He's changing," Cameron said quietly. She followed his gaze through the glass. Where Dominic was speaking to a team member, his tone almost gentle. "He is," she admitted. "People can change when they finally choose to see." Cameron studied her for a moment. "And you?" He asked, "What do you see?" She smiled, thoughtful. "I see someone trying, and that matters more than perfection." There was no bitterness in her voice, only peace. Later that evening, the office emptied one by one. Only the glow from Victoria's lamp and the faint hum of the city below remained. She gathered her things when Dominic's voice came softly. "Victoria, may I borrow a moment?" She turned. "Of course." He stood by the window. The skyline reflected across the glass like a sea of stars. "The board approved the expansion," he said absently. "It's going to be our biggest project yet. I want you to lead the coordination team." She blinked, startled. "Me?" "Yes," he said simply. "You've been doing half that work for years without the title. It's past time you had it, and the salary that goes with it." Emotion flickered through her eyes. She nodded slowly. "Thank you." He smiled faintly. "Don't thank me, just promise you'll keep telling me when I get it wrong." She laughed softly. "That might be often." "Then I'll learn often," he replied. For a moment they stood in comfortable silence, the kind that needs no words. "You were right," he said quietly. "About people not being projects, I spent years perfecting everything except myself, and I almost lost the only person who ever made this place feel alive." She met his gaze steadily. "Dominic, we don't always get to rewrite the past, but we can choose what comes next." He nodded. "And what comes next for you?" She looked out at the city. "A life that feels like mine," she said simply. "Work I love, people I respect, moments I don't have to hide in." He exhaled slowly, accepting the truth in her answer. "And if that life ever crosses paths with me again?" She smiled, a small, genuine smile that carried both warmth and distance. "Then maybe we'll recognize each other without forgetting who we are." He wanted to reach out, to hold her hand just once, but he didn't. Instead, he offered the only thing he could: respect. "You deserve every bit of that life, Victoria," he said. She turned to leave, pausing at the doorway. "And you deserve peace." "Dominic," she said softly. "Not the kind that comes from control, but the kind that comes from grace." Then she was gone. Weeks passed, and the building thrived under a quieter kind of leadership. Dominic learned to say thank you, to listen before deciding, to let go without losing direction. Cameron and Victoria continued to work closely. Their partnership, professional yet grounded in genuine friendship, and though some whispered of romance, neither confirmed nor denied, they simply lived. Unafraid of being seen, one evening, as sunlight poured gold through the windows, Dominic walked past Victoria's old desk. The orchid still bloomed there, cared for by someone else now. He stopped, touched one petal gently, and smiled to himself. For years he had thought power meant being untouchable. Now he understood that the real power was in connection, in kindness, in seeing the unseen. He looked out over the city he once conquered through will and numbers, and for the first time, it looked back at him not as a reflection of dominance, but as a reminder of humanity. Somewhere out there was the woman who had taught him that. Not through rebellion, not through revenge, but simply by existing fully in her own light. And as the sky faded into the soft lavender of evening, Dominic Ashford whispered a quiet truth meant for no one but himself. She was never invisible. It was me who was blind. The wind through the open window carried his words away, scattering them like petals across the city that never truly sleeps, and somewhere, maybe in another building glowing with ambition. Victoria Chen smiled without knowing why, feeling lighter, freer, seen, because in the end, invisibility had never been her curse. It had been his mirror. And when she walked away, she did not fade. She shined. The end.